John Ciardi's How Does a Poem Mean? Stands as a foundational text in poetry analysis, blending literary theory with practical guidance on reading and understanding poetry. The book transcends conventional manuals by shifting the reader's focus from simply deciphering a poem's meaning to engaging with the intricate processes through which a poem functions. Ciardi's work is less about defining poetry in rigid terms and more about inviting readers to explore how poetry communicates beyond literal language, fostering a deeper, more personal connection with the text. At the core of Ciardi's philosophy is the distinction between what a poem means and how it means. This subtle yet crucial difference challenges the reader to go beyond surface-level interpretation and consider the mechanisms that give a poem its emotional and intellectual impact. According to Ciardi, a poem is not merely a vessel for content, but a dynamic system where form and meaning interact symbiotically. The title itself poses an essential question. How does a poem operate as a living structure of language, metaphor, rhythm, and sound? Ciardi emphasizes that poetry should be approached as an experience rather than a puzzle to be solved. He argues against purely analytical readings that reduce poems to summaries of their thematic elements, urging readers instead to immerse themselves in the linguistic texture and emotional resonance of the text. This perspective positions poetry as an art form that transcends straightforward communication, engaging readers in a participatory act of meaning making. Ciardi's insistence on this experiential approach is central to his broader educational philosophy that the value of poetry lies not in extracting a singular, fixed meaning, but in appreciating the multiplicity of interpretations that arise through active engagement. One of the key elements Ciardi explores is the importance of form in poetry. He presents form not as a rigid framework, but as an integral part of a poem's expressive capacity. Elements such as meter, rhyme, stanza structure, and line breaks are not arbitrary. They are deliberate choices that shape the reader's experience and influence the poem's meaning. Ciardi highlights how rhythm, for example, creates a musicality that enhances emotional tone, while enjambment can introduce tension or surprise. These formal qualities are inseparable from the poem's content, working together to produce a unified effect. Ciardi also devotes attention to the concept of metaphor, which he views as the heartbeat of poetic language. For Ciardi, metaphor is more than a stylistic device. It is the means through which poetry captures complexity, contradiction, and emotional depth. Metaphor allows the poet to draw connections between disparate ideas, creating layers of meaning that resist reductive interpretation. Ciardi illustrates this through examples, showing how metaphor invites the reader to enter the poet's imaginative world, fostering a deeper understanding that goes beyond the literal. The book places strong emphasis on the role of the reader in the creation of meaning. Ciardi suggests that reading poetry is an active process that requires intellectual and emotional investment. The reader must bring their own experiences, sensibilities, and interpretive skills to the text, making meaning in collaboration with the poet. This idea democratizes poetry, breaking down the barrier between poet and audience, and positioning the act of reading as a creative endeavor in its own right. Ciardi's approach encourages readers to trust their responses while also cultivating the analytical tools necessary for deeper engagement. Ciardi also critiques common educational practices that treat poetry as a code to be deciphered, leading students to focus solely on what the poet meant. This reductive method, he argues, strips poetry of its vitality and alienates readers. Instead, Ciardi advocates for teaching poetry as a lived experience, where the focus is on how the poem evokes feeling, thought, and reflection. He underscores the importance of emotional resonance, arguing that a poem's success is measured not by the clarity of its message, but by the strength of its impact on the reader. Another significant aspect of Ciardi's work is his attention to the historical and cultural dimensions of poetry. While he champions the personal experience of the reader, he also acknowledges that understanding a poem's context can enrich interpretation. Language evolves within cultural frameworks, and poetry often reflects or challenges the social conditions of its time. Ciardi encourages readers to consider how historical context, literary traditions, and biographical details might inform a poem's themes and techniques, without allowing these elements to overshadow the reader's personal engagement with the text. Ciardi further explores the idea of the poem as a form of communication that operates on multiple levels. He introduces the concept of the inside and outside of a poem, the outside being its literal narrative or surface message, and the inside being its deeper emotional and psychological undercurrents. This duality allows a poem to speak simultaneously to the intellect and the emotions, creating a layered experience for the reader. Ciardi stresses that a good poem balances these layers, avoiding overt didacticism, while still engaging the reader's critical faculties. Throughout the book, Ciardi employs a conversational tone, making complex ideas accessible without sacrificing depth. His use of examples from canonical poets like Shakespeare and Donne to modern voices demonstrates the universality of the principles he outlines. Each example serves to illustrate how the techniques he discusses function in actual poetic practice, bridging the gap between theory and application. This pedagogical approach reflects Ciardi's broader mission to empower readers to read poetry not as passive recipients of meaning, but as active participants in a dialogue with the text. In addition to its focus on analysis, How Does a Poem Mean is deeply invested in the idea of poetry as a humanizing force. Ciardi views poetry as a means of fostering empathy, introspection, and a deeper understanding of the human condition. In a world often dominated by utilitarian values, poetry offers an alternative space where complexity, ambiguity, and emotional depth are not only accepted, but celebrated. This humanistic vision aligns with Ciardi's broader belief in the transformative power of literature to enrich individual lives and cultural discourse. The book also addresses the challenges of writing poetry, providing insight into the creative process. Ciardi discusses the discipline involved in crafting a poem, emphasizing that inspiration must be matched with technical skill. He rejects the notion of the poet as a passive vessel for spontaneous inspiration, instead portraying poetry as the result of deliberate and thoughtful labor. This perspective demystifies the act of writing, making it more approachable for aspiring poets, while still honoring its artistic rigor.